The year is 1803, and the destiny of the North American landmass hangs in the balance. Not in the corridors of Washington or the streets of New York, but in a bathing tub in Paris. The French first consul soaks in heated water, seeking relief from a persistent skin ailment. His siblings, Joseph and Lucien, stand nearby. A fierce disagreement unfolds. The dispute grows so intense that water splashes onto their costly garments. The subject of their heated exchange is an expanse of land so immense it extends from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, and from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian frontier. This domain surpasses the combined size of France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Germany. This is the Louisiana Territory, and the decision has just been made to sell it. To contemporary observers, this transaction appears as the most remarkable real estate acquisition in recorded history. The American president secured 828,000 square miles of territory for $15 million. This calculates to approximately 4 cents per acre. The size of the United States doubled in a single moment. The path was cleared for America to emerge as a continental superpower. It appears as a masterstroke by the Americans and a moment of folly by the French. Why would the greatest military leader of his era surrender the heartland of North America for currency that couldn't even finance his military operations for 30 days? The explanation is not incompetence. The real story is that this land transaction was not truly about Louisiana at all. It concerned a small Caribbean island thousands of miles distant. It involved an enslaved people's uprising that decimated Europe's finest military force. It featured a Mosquito that claimed more French lives than British weapons. And it centered on an approaching conflict that compelled a desperate ruler to dispose of a failing investment before adversaries could seize it. This is the account of how the Haitian Revolution and yellow fever rescued the United States. This is the narrative of how a Caribbean collapse created a Mississippi windfall. To comprehend why this sale occurred, we must understand the original purpose. We must return to the year 1800. At this moment, France possessed no North American holdings. They had surrendered Canada to the British 40 years prior. But the French leader harbored ambitions. He termed it his Western design. He sought to reconstruct the French Empire across the Americas. He intended to resurrect the magnificence of New France. However, this new empire would not depend on fur commerce in Quebec's frozen woodlands. It would rest upon sugar production and enslaved labor in the Caribbean's tropical climate. The centerpiece of this envisioned empire was the colony of Saint-Domingue, known today as Haiti. In 1789, on the eve of the French Revolution, Saint-Domingue ranked as the world's most lucrative colony. It generated 40% of Europe's sugar and 60% of its coffee. People called it the Pearl of the Antilles. It created more prosperity for France than all 13 American colonies produced for Britain combined. Yet this prosperity was constructed upon a foundation of human suffering. 500,000 enslaved Africans labored on plantations under conditions of unspeakable cruelty. The mortality rate climbed so high that the French constantly imported new captives from Africa merely to maintain workforce numbers stable. The plan was straightforward and merciless. Total control would be restored over Saint-Domingue, which had existed in a state of rebellion since 1791. Slavery would be reintroduced after being abolished during the radical phase of the French Revolution. The island would be transformed back into a revenue generator for the French state. But a problem existed. You cannot consume sugar. The enslaved population of Saint-Domingue required food, and the island was entirely committed to cash crops. They also needed lumber to construct sugar mills and barrels. This is where Louisiana entered the strategy. In the grand scheme, the Louisiana Territory was not designed to be a major settlement for French citizens. It was intended as the breadbasket for the sugar islands. Farmers in the Mississippi Valley would cultivate corn, wheat, and salted pork. They would harvest cypress trees for lumber. They would load everything onto barges and transport it down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. From New Orleans, supplies would be shipped to Saint-Domingue to feed the enslaved workers producing sugar. Louisiana was simply a support mechanism for the Caribbean plantation economy. It was the farm that sustained the factory. So in 1800, a secret agreement was made with Spain. Spain had controlled Louisiana for the previous 40 years, but they were vulnerable and terrified. In the secret treaty of San Ildefonso, Spain agreed to return Louisiana to France. In exchange, the promise was made to create a kingdom in Italy for the Spanish monarch's son-in-law. It was a classic old-world dynastic exchange, a portion of Italy for the center of North America. The agreement remained secret because there was no desire to alarm the British or Americans prematurely. But to make this Western design function, Saint-Domingue had to be retaken first. The island was currently under the authority of Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint was a former enslaved person who had risen to become a brilliant military leader and the de facto ruler of the colony. He was technically loyal to France, but he governed the island as an independent state. He had written his own constitution. He had negotiated commercial arrangements with the Americans. He was a rival, and rivals could not be tolerated. In 1801, a massive invasion force was assembled. The brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, was dispatched with 20,000 of France's finest troops. These were battle-hardened veterans who had conquered Italy and Egypt. Their orders were secret and brutal. They were to deceive Toussaint with peace promises, then arrest and deport him. Then they were to disarm the black population. Finally, once the population was defenseless, they were to issue a decree restoring slavery. It was a plan of systematic betrayal. The expedition reached Haiti in February 1802. Initially, events proceeded favorably. The French military possessed superior firepower. They captured the coastal cities. Toussaint Louverture recognized he could not defeat the French in direct combat, so he withdrew into the mountains. He conducted guerrilla warfare, burning plantations and contaminating water sources. He instructed his officers that they must await their greatest ally. That ally was the rainy season. Toussaint understood that when rains arrived, mosquitoes would multiply and yellow fever would strike. He famously declared that the insects would serve as soldiers. General Leclerc displayed arrogance. He wrote letters boasting that he would pacify the island within weeks. He deceived Toussaint into attending a meeting, arrested him, and transported him to a frigid prison cell in the Jura Mountains of France, where the great liberator would eventually perish from pneumonia and neglect. With Toussaint removed, Leclerc believed the conflict had ended. He began disarming the population. But then whispers began circulating. Information arrived from the nearby island of Guadeloupe that the French had restored slavery there. The black population of Saint-Domingue understood that the same destiny awaited them. They rose in a second massive rebellion wave. This time, it became a war of extermination. The rebel motto was independence or death. And then the rains arrived. The yellow fever epidemic of 1802 ranked among history's worst. French soldiers who possessed no immunity began dying by the thousands. It commenced with headaches and fever. Then skin turned yellow and eyes became bloodshot. Then came black vomit. Within days, strong, healthy men were deceased. The hospitals overflowed. The dead accumulated in streets because insufficient people remained to bury them. General Leclerc watched his magnificent army dissolve. He penned desperate correspondence requesting reinforcements. He stated he possessed no army remaining, only a hospital. By the conclusion of 1802, the general himself had died from the fever. Of the 20,000 men initially sent, only a few thousand remained standing, and they were terrified. Another 20,000 troops were dispatched, but they perished equally fast. A French historian later calculated that 50,000 French soldiers, sailors, and administrators died in the failed attempt to retake Saint-Domingue. It was a catastrophe. The Western design was drowning in blood and vomit. A cold pragmatist, the French ruler sat in his office in the Tuileries Palace and examined the reports. He recognized the endeavor had failed. Without Saint-Domingue, Louisiana was worthless. If no sugar colony existed to feed, no breadbasket was needed. Louisiana represented a massive treasury drain. It generated zero tax revenue. It was populated by a few thousand French settlers and thousands of Native American warriors who had no interest in Parisian rule. To maintain Louisiana, thousands of troops would need to garrison forts along the Mississippi. But troops were dying in the Caribbean or needed in Europe, and Europe was becoming dangerous again. The Peace of Amiens, which had paused the war between France and Britain, was deteriorating. War was approaching, and when war was declared, the British Navy would blockade French ports. Britain dominated the seas. Looking at the map revealed Louisiana was indefensible. The British Navy could sail into the Gulf of Mexico and seize New Orleans at will. British troops in Canada could march south and seize the upper Mississippi. France possessed no navy to defend the colony. A stark choice presented itself. Louisiana could be held and inevitably lost to the British, who would claim it free as wartime spoils, or it could be sold to the Americans. Selling would provide money to fund the European war. But more importantly, it would achieve a strategic masterstroke. It would strengthen the United States. The belief was that a powerful United States would eventually rival Britain. The famous declaration was made that England had been given a maritime rival that would sooner or later humble her pride. But the Americans were not contemplating global geopolitics. They were focused on shipping logistics. For Americans, the Louisiana issue concerned not land, but water. The United States in 1803 terminated at the Mississippi River. The entire economy of Western territories, states like Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee, depended on the river. Farmers transported their whiskey and flour down the Mississippi to New Orleans, where cargo was loaded onto ocean-going vessels. Spain had permitted Americans to utilize the New Orleans port tax-free. This was termed the right of deposit. But in 1802, just as the French prepared to assume control, the Spanish governor of New Orleans suddenly revoked the right of deposit. The river closed. The American economy panicked. Western farmers discussed seizing New Orleans by force. The American president was a pacifist, but he recognized action was necessary. He famously wrote that on the globe existed one single location, whose possessor was their natural and habitual enemy. That location was New Orleans. Having the French leader as a neighbor was terrifying. Spain represented a weak neighbor, and Americans knew they could eventually dominate Spain. But France was a predator. The fear was that if French troops occupied New Orleans, they would close the river permanently. The fear was that the United States would be compelled to ally with the British to combat the French. The concept of allying with King George was repulsive, but the French threat was existential. So a move was made. A trusted associate, James Monroe, was dispatched to Paris. Monroe's mission was straightforward and modest. He was authorized to offer up to $10 million for the city of New Orleans and the immediate surrounding area. That was all. The Americans didn't desire the millions of acres of western wilderness. They simply wanted the port. They simply wanted to secure the river mouth. Monroe carried instructions stating that if France refused to sell New Orleans, he should proceed to London and negotiate an alliance with the British. It was high-stakes diplomatic poker. Monroe set sail for France in March of 1803. He traveled slowly across the Atlantic, unaware of dramatic events unfolding. He was unaware the French army in Haiti had been annihilated. He was unaware that the decision had already been made to dispose of the entire territory. When Monroe arrived in Paris expecting difficult negotiations, he expected resistance. He met with Robert Livingston, the American ambassador in Paris, who had been attempting for months to secure a meeting with Talleyrand, the French foreign minister. Livingston felt frustrated, deaf, and ignored by the French court. On April 11, 1803, Talleyrand finally summoned Livingston. Talleyrand was a cunning character, a survivor who had served the king, the revolution, and now the current regime. He regarded Livingston and posed a question that stunned the American. He asked simply, what would be given for the whole of Louisiana? Livingston believed he had misheard. He responded they only desired New Orleans. With a smile came the reply to consider the entire territory. Everything was available for sale. Livingston departed in a state of shock. He awaited Monroe's arrival. The following day when Monroe entered, Livingston shared the news. They were supposed to purchase a city and were being offered a continent. They examined their instructions. Their instructions mentioned nothing about purchasing territory west of the Mississippi. They possessed no authority to expend $15 million. They had no method to contact Washington. A letter would require 6 weeks to arrive and 6 weeks to return. By that time, the decision might be reversed. By that time, the British might declare war and seize the territory. Monroe and Livingston stood alone in a Paris room facing the most significant decision in American history. If they agreed, they might face impeachment for exceeding authority. They might bankrupt the United States Treasury. But if they declined, they would forfeit the opportunity of a lifetime. They would leave the door open for Britain or France to control North America's future. They examined the map, they looked at each other, and they decided to act independently. They decided to disregard the Constitution and ignore their instructions. They decided to purchase the world. As we conclude the first portion of this narrative, we leave Monroe and Livingston in that Paris room, their hands trembling as they prepare to negotiate specifics. We leave the French leader fuming at his Caribbean dream's failure, turning his attention away from the Americas and back toward European battlefields. We observe the vast Louisiana territory, waiting in history's silence, its indigenous inhabitants unaware their land is being traded by men who have never visited it. In the second portion of the narrative, we will examine the transaction mechanics. We will discover how the United States, which possessed almost no money, managed to finance the purchase. We will encounter the British bankers who ironically financed their own country's enemy. And we will witness the chaotic and often tragic power transfer that reshaped a continent forever. James Monroe and Robert Livingston sat across the table from François Barbé-Marbois, the French finance minister. It was late April, 1803. The Paris atmosphere was thick with war rumors. The British ambassador was departing. The peace was collapsing. Orders were being screamed to generals to prepare for an English invasion. Amidst this chaos, 3 men attempted to finalize history's largest land transaction details. The negotiation concerned not territorial borders because nobody actually knew where borders existed. When Livingston inquired about Louisiana's eastern boundary, the famous reply was that knowledge was lacking, and they must accept it as received from Spain. When Livingston inquired about the western boundary, a shrug accompanied the response that they would likely maximize it. It was a purchase of vague abstraction. The Americans were acquiring a claim, not a survey. They were purchasing the right to displace Native American nations that actually inhabited the region. The negotiation centered entirely on finances. Cash was wanted immediately. 50 million francs were needed to construct flat-bottom boats for invading England. The final agreed price was $15 million. This represented a staggering sum for the young American Republic. The entire federal budget of the United States in 1803 totaled only approximately $8 million. Effectively, 2 years of national income was being spent on a single purchase. It would resemble a modern president expending $10 trillion on a contemporary land deal. But here was the complication. The United States did not possess $15 million. No gold existed in the vault. No silver existed in the treasury. They were a land-rich, cash-poor nation. So how does one finance an empire when broke? The answer resided in international finance's complex world. The answer resided with the very enemy being prepared to fight, the British. The financing of this purchase constitutes one of history's great ironies. The United States issued bonds. A bond essentially represents an IOU. The government promised to repay bondholders with interest over 15 years. But American bonds couldn't pay soldiers. French shipyards couldn't be paid with paper signed by the American president. Gold coin was necessary. Enter the House of Baring. Baring Brothers ranked among London's most powerful merchant banks. They were thoroughly British. Their chairman, Sir Francis Baring, was a British establishment pillar. Yet Baring Brothers, alongside a Dutch bank called Hope and Company, agreed to finance the transaction. They purchased American bonds at a discount, providing the hard cash needed immediately. They then sold bonds to investors across Europe and London. Consider the implications. British bankers were raising money from British investors to provide to the French leader so he could construct an army to attack Britain. It appears treasonous, but to City of London bankers, it was merely business. They reasoned that if they declined the deal, a French bank would accept. They reasoned the United States represented good credit risk, and they reasoned the money would probably be wasted anyway. When the British Prime Minister Henry Addington learned of the deal, he did not intervene. He simply shrugged. Capital flows where profit exists. So gold flowed from London to Paris, and the title deed flowed from Paris to Washington. The treaty was signed on April 30th, 1803. As they signed the document, Robert Livingston stood and made a prophecy. He stated they had lived long, but this represented the noblest work of their entire lives. From this day forward, the United States assumes its place among first-rank powers. But back in Washington, the American president felt no nobility. He felt constitutional crisis. He was a strict constructionist. He believed the federal government could only perform exactly what the Constitution authorized. He had spent his entire political career opposing those who wanted strong central government with broad powers. He had argued that if it wasn't written in the Constitution, the president couldn't execute it. Now, examining the Constitution revealed no single sentence stating the president possessed power to purchase foreign territory. Terror existed about becoming the very thing he opposed, a tyrant who ignored law. He wrote correspondence to associates admitting the purchase represented an act beyond constitutional authority. He drafted a constitutional amendment to legalize the transaction, but advisors indicated no time existed. The decision might be reversed. The British might intervene. They instructed him to abandon his principles and sign the treaty. Agonizing occurred, but ultimately, pragmatism prevailed. Recognition dawned that the agrarian republic's future he envisioned depended on land. A nation of yeoman farmers was desired, and that required space. He justified the purchase as necessary evil for the greater good. He later compared it to a guardian investing a ward's money, stating he did what was best for the country, even if rules were broken to accomplish it. The Senate ratified the treaty, and the United States doubled in size. The territory transfer was bizarre political theater. Remember that officially Spain still governed Louisiana. The secret treaty where Spain transferred it to France had never been publicly implemented. So before the French could transfer it to Americans, Spanish first had to transfer it to French. On November 30th, 1803, in the Cabildo building in New Orleans, the Spanish governor formally transferred city keys to the French representative Pierre Clément de Losas. The Spanish flag was lowered, and the French tricolor was raised. For 20 days, and only 20 days, France ruled Louisiana. Those 20 days were spent abolishing Spanish laws and appointing French officials, knowing full well they would all soon be dismissed. Then on December 20th, the Americans arrived. The weather was cold and rainy. A crowd assembled in the plaza, now Jackson Square. The French flag was slowly lowered. As it descended, it met the American flag being raised. The two flags tangled momentarily at the pole's center, a fitting symbol of the entangled histories of two nations. Then the stars and stripes reached the summit. A single cannon shot rang out. The crowd, mostly French and Spanish, stood in silence. They were not celebrating. They were confused. They had gone to sleep Spanish, woken French, and were now going to bed American. They had not been consulted. Their nationality had been altered by a signature in a room 3,000 miles distant. But the transfer narrative contains a darker chapter in the North. In the city of St. Louis, capital of Upper Louisiana, the transfer occurred 3 months later in March 1804. It was known as the Day of Three Flags. On March 9th, the Spanish flag was lowered and the French flag was raised. The American captain, Meriwether Lewis, who was about to depart on his famous Pacific expedition, was present. The French flag flew for 24 hours. The people of St. Louis, mostly French settlers, cheered to witness their old flag again. They sang songs. They celebrated throughout the night. Then on the morning of March 10th, the French flag descended, and the American flag ascended. The cheering ceased. Settlers observed the new soldiers in their rough uniforms and recognized their world had ended. The American era brought with it a flood of settlers from Kentucky and Tennessee. These men did not respect French customs or Spanish land grants. They were land-hungry and aggressive. They brought with them the English language, common law, and deep racism against indigenous people. And this brings us to the true victims of this purchase, the Native Americans. The treaty text promised to respect inhabitants' rights, but Americans did not consider the Sioux, Cheyenne, Osage, or Comanche to be inhabitants in the legal sense. They considered them obstacles. To Native Americans, the concept that one foreign leader could sell their land to another foreign leader was absurd. They had never heard of these distant rulers. They had never encountered these foreign men. They were masters of the plains. They possessed their own empires, trade networks, and diplomacy. But this purchase transformed the legal framework of their dispossession. Before 1803, the United States had to negotiate with these nations as foreign powers beyond its borders. After 1803, the United States considered them subjects living within American territory. It provided legal justification to begin removal policy. Looking at the vast emptiness of the new map revealed a place where eastern tribes could be deported. The Trail of Tears was made possible because a destination existed for the tears. That destination was Louisiana Territory. The purchase also planted seeds of the American Civil War. As long as the United States was confined to the east, the balance between slave states and free states could be managed. But with acquisition of this vast new territory, the question arose every time a new state formed. Would it be slave or free? Would slavery expand westward? This question plagued the American political system for 60 years. The Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, all these crises were direct consequences of this purchase. The land acquired to secure Union safety eventually tore the Union apart. And what of the French leader? What was done with the $15 million? It was spent. Barges were built. The Grand Army assembled at Boulogne on France's coast. Preparation was made to cross the Channel, but it never occurred. The British Navy was too formidable. In 1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, Lord Nelson destroyed the French and Spanish fleets. The dream of invading England perished. Armies turned eastward and marched across Europe, winning brilliant victories at Austerlitz and Jena, creating a continental empire that endured for a decade before collapsing in Russia's snows. The $15 million purchased a few years of warfare, but it cost France future superpower status. If France had retained Louisiana, world history would appear vastly different. North America might have been divided between an English-speaking East and French-speaking West. The United States might have remained a second-rate regional power hemmed in by rival empires. By selling the territory, the last barrier to American expansion was removed. The very giant was created that would eventually return to Europe in 1917 and 1944 to rescue France from Germany. Today, if you walk through New Orleans' French Quarter, you can still observe this history's remnants. You witness Spanish architecture with its iron balconies. You hear French street names. You consume food that blends African, Native American, and European ingredients. It is a city that remembers it was once a pawn in a global chess game. But the most significant monument to this purchase is not a building or statue. It is the United States map itself. It is the nation's shape. It is the reality that a country beginning as 13 Atlantic coast colonies now spans a continent. This reality was not forged by destiny or divine providence. It was forged by the yellow fever mosquito in Haiti's swamps. It was forged by Toussaint Louverture's resistance and his army of former enslaved people who shattered the French Empire's will. We often learn history as a catalog of great individuals making great decisions. We learn certain leaders were visionaries and geniuses. But the story of this purchase teaches a different lesson. It teaches that history is chaotic. It is driven by unintended consequences. The American president didn't desire the whole territory. He simply wanted a city. The French leader didn't wish to sell. He was compelled by disease and defeat. The United States didn't possess the money. They had to borrow it from the seller's enemy. It was a fire sale, a liquidation of a failed business venture. The French Empire in the Americas went bankrupt, and the United States purchased the assets for pennies on the dollar. The irony is that Haiti's enslaved people, who fought for their own freedom and destroyed the Western dream, ended up inadvertently doubling a slave republic's size in North America. Their Caribbean victory for liberty led to Mississippi Valley slavery expansion. It is a bitter and complex legacy. So the next time you observe an American West map, remember you are viewing a French catastrophe's debris. You're observing the result of a bad day in a Paris bathtub. You're observing the legacy of Saint-Domingue's mosquitoes. This purchase was not a triumph of American diplomacy. It was the greatest fortunate occurrence in nation's history, a gift from a world at war's chaos.